and the green light comes on.
Okay.
And so
Turn this on now or later?
yeah, it's up to you, whatever you prefer. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I always feel bad because I have to interrupt your conversations. You're having such lovely conversations. But it is 10 a.m., so we're going to get started. Welcome to Ames Public Library for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. I'm Megan. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the library, and our mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. We always invite you to join us for future programs. While I know our genealogy programming is a little sparse in the summer, it's a good reminder that you are all welcome to participate in our summer reading program. Adults can participate too. We have prizes. Your final prize is a book, a brand new book. So if you don't participate in summer reading, I certainly encourage you to do that. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames Public Library YouTube channel after the program ends. For those of you online, we'll mute your microphones during the presentation. So if you have any questions, please share those via the chat function. And if you get bumped out of the event, just follow the original link to get right back to us. And at this time, please join me in welcoming John Wilson for his presentation.
Thank you. First thing, wow, it's a lot easier shortening a story when you're 19 than it is when you're 77. Which leads me into talking about, if we can imagine for a moment, in Iowa City, Iowa, in 1941, 4 days after the Pearl Harbor, Italy and Germany have declared war on the United States. So all three Axis powers now is at war against the United States. Let's imagine a young 19-year-old man just graduated from high school. His name, Robert Wilson, perhaps is walking downtown from his parents' home on Dodge Street. We imagine this day that it's very, very cold. The Japanese military invasion has occurred, and Dad is walking down toward the recruitment center for his first rejection from the Army recruitment. I just thought I'd mention a little bit about the storyline purpose, which is presented here. It seems to me that so often when I get around to asking questions, like questions that I had of Dad, when they come to mind, it's past the time when I can ask them. When did Bob get deployed into the Army? Where was he deployed during his Army training? In this talk, I'm going to sketch out the general timeline of his World War II military journey. Dad left a mixture of materials that he saved that came to me, and I will try to find some clues and context about the battle campaigns in the war he fought long ago, recognizing that Dad was from a different time, a different culture, and a different generation than we are in now. Dad's World War II experience. Okay. When I was a teenager, Dad very briefly told me that he had been awarded the Bronze Star Medal, but had never received it. Nothing was said to me about why he received the award. I remember when he said it, but I don't remember much about it. By the time Dad died of complications of Addison's disease and cancer, I became convinced that the medal he had received was from the fighting during the Battle of the Bulge. A few years after Dad died, in 1998, in 2003, I began volunteering for a time in citizen capacity for the National Guard for the Enduring Families program. I gathered the records that I knew about of Dad's, and then sent them on to the National Personnel Records Center. This here was the answer I received for my request for the National Records Personnel Center. I didn't know that fire had occurred. Did you? 70% of the materials in World War II was lost. And I just didn't know that. Looking through Dad's World War II memorabilia after a number of materials came down to me, I stuffed myself with bananas. Well, Dad left a very few anecdotes, and that was one of them. Uh, when we were living in Nevada, Iowa, I remember he was in the kitchen. Maybe he was eating a banana, I don't know. But he said that he didn't meet the guidelines for as far as weight goes. And so he was told to stuff himself with bananas until he came back to the next time. So Dad said he stuffed himself with bananas. He came back to the office, and sure enough, when he returned to the Iowa Enlistment Center, he met the physical eligibility guidelines for induction into the Army. Uh-huh. In June 1942, Dad went from the Camp Dodge Induction Center in Johnston, Iowa, to a boot camp in Fort Knox, Kentucky. This was the only photo that Dad saved from that time period. Note the tank where Private Bob and the other soldier were seated is of World War I vintage, according to Michael Vogt, curator at the Camp Dodge Training Center, who looked at this picture. For the first year, Dad was in different southern United States deployments. But then, in 19th of June, 1943, he was sent to Hawaii. This was his longest deployment in the United States and territories. Between June of 1943 until February of 1944, Dad's training camp assignments were in the territory of the Hawaiian Islands. When he was transferred to Hawaii, he had responsibilities as a light truck driver on the islands, and he was part of the medical detachment unit. So when I looked at the letters, I might just add that when I started looking at some of the pictures of Hawaii, I saw all these bandages, and I thought, oh my gosh, all these people are from Pearl Harbor. Well, Dad was in the medical detachment unit. And so they would, they were preparing for what would happen. And he decided to take pictures of himself and others there. Anyway, Bob would frequently write to his family during this time, and he commented about the training. He'd also ask for news about other family members, especially his older brother Charles, who had been in Africa and also Italy when he was wounded during his time in Hawaii. One of the letters from Hawaii begins, "Dear folks, I saw that Noel Coward show in which we serve. I thought it stunk. Then he goes on to say, what did Willie Hall say in the letter he wrote to you? I'm really interested." It's near the end of the war, I would find Bob's story shows him writing again to his pal Emmett Willie. By late 1943, however, Dad had been nearly a year in Hawaii, and he wanted out of there. He asked for a transfer out of the tank battalion and even wrote to his dad asking him if he could get a letter of support for transferring to the Army Air Force. This is where part 2, staging for war. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, from May 3rd to October 1944. Does anybody know about Camp Shelby? Lynn, yeah, Lynn. I read Lynn's family's albums about that. Retired commander, Captain John Fritz said that this is where the war really started for Bob. Camp Shelby begins the second part of Dad's soldier story because at Shelby, the Army mission has changed. The Army mission was to prepare the recruits to go into combat directly. At that time in 1944, multiple Army divisions at Camp Shelby were undergoing very rigorous basic training, according to Army histories later written about the sprawling basic training camp. A nickname, we're all adults here, a nickname given to the 69th Infantry was BBBB. Who knows what that was? Well, it was Bolty's bitching, bivouacking bastards, you know. That was their nickname. But shortly after Dad came to the camp, however, there was a new commander that took over there, Commander Reinhold. In April or May of 1945, the U.S. Army transferred Bob and a large number of former Army Air Force trainees from California to Camp Shelby. This was the Army making this transfer. PFC, by this time, Wilson, wrote to his dad in Iowa City at night using old Army Air Force stationery. So the stationery is not the 69th, it's still the old Army Air Force stationery. This is the only letter in which where he swears to his parents about being eaten up by chiggers and being assigned to the damned infantry to help out in the machine gun section. So a change, you know. I found out that a 2-week problem, anybody know what that is? Problem is like maneuvers, campaign maneuvers, pretty intensive, you know, like the Reds against the White side. So it's preparing for war through the campaign. Did you were you familiar with that, Greg? Okay. So he had done this for 2 weeks. He wasn't happy about it. He would continue going on doing that, though, for many more months. But of course, over 7 months' time, there were times where they had leave, and one of them was in New Orleans. A pamphlet that Dad kept that I keep here. He had 2 copies of that. The official pamphlet said, "Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Who will ever forget it? The place could get so cold in the winter and hot in the summer. But the time spent in Shelby netted us many friendships. There was always New Orleans, remember." The official history doesn't say anything more about that. But when I was only 14, Dad took our family by car from our home in Nevada, Iowa, to visit a former soldier friend and his family who were then living in New Orleans. It's not the person in this picture, however. I found out that his friend's name was Clem, had been Dad's best man at his wedding. He was also my godfather. I found out then. In November 1944, Bob's unit in the 69th Infantry finally leaves Camp Shelby basic training in Mississippi. A Pullman train carries the Army division to New Jersey for a final physical, where the physical is if if it didn't show through your body, you passed. That was the physical one when they did the x-rays, yeah. He was then transported to New York Harbor to join a convoy to England on the SS John Ericsson transport ship. Before the start of the war, that particular ship had been a luxury liner, and the famous author J.D. Salinger had been the entertainment director on that luxury ship. Army histories show these were Army men that had been in the swamps for 7 months. Was there seasickness? A distant relative, good friend, Glenn, said that his father still went over about a month later and remembered how they were seasick going over on the ship, crowded ship, you know. December 1, this is the route to Germany that I'm talking about here. Dad wrote, after arriving in Southampton, southern England, we went on to different sites and then talks about France. After they arrived, right after they arrived, this was like November, December 1944. What was going on? There was, yeah. Dad remained with his unit, but 2,200 men were taken out from the 69th Division right at Christmas time. Many of them would lose their lives at the Battle of the Bulge, according to official directory of this history. The rest of the regiment continued training for a few more weeks. They also did some sightseeing, as you see here in Dad's letter. But on January 21st, 1945, Dad was among the first soldiers from the 69th Infantry to board a ship called the HMS Langley Castle, and that transported them to the Havre, France. A ruined city, by the way. It was just a ruins. The third part of World War II is the Rhineland campaign. Third part, this was the first major campaign that Dad was in. What I have done here is Bob didn't keep any war journals. He didn't keep any long notes, any of that. But what he did was when he wrote letters, he would say sometimes where he had been. So that's the list on the left there, different places where he had what he called military excursions. He also kept private handwritten notes, and looking at the handwritten notes here on the right-hand side that Dad kept privately, it starts out with Hellerith in the middle there. These are towns where Dad was engaged in combat. He didn't share these notes, as I said, with his family during his lifetime, to my knowledge, but it does preview a more detailed chronicle of the towns Dad would fight in or march through during 2 months of steady combat duty. This comic map here is a general representation of the route Dad took during his first campaign. Some of these towns Dad wrote about when he was still in Germany. If you look toward the bottom, what I think is the bottom left center there, yeah, there it is Schmeitheim. Schmeitheim? My pronunciation probably wrong. It was near this German border town, about 19 miles away, that Dad was deployed. In 1945, the 69th Army Division was facing the German Army. Perhaps less than a quarter mile was the village of Hollerith, which had led to a highway toward the Rhine. Perhaps Hollerith might have been like from our house to the clubhouse, from the village of Hollerith, where the line was, the inner Ziegfeld line where Dad was stationed at. On 22nd of February, 1945, just days before the U.S. assault on the German defense, Dad wrote several V letters to his family. And V letters were microfilmed letters, so you could put several of the letters together in them. In this V-mail envelope, I found 4 different letters in a packet. Using the V-mail used a special form, enabling the letters to be photographed on microfilm, according to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. On February 22nd, Dad was suddenly in a writing mood. As I opened one of the envelopes originally mailed in Iowa City, a coin fell out. It was a German coin. It hadn't been opened maybe since 1945. It's an odd sensation seeing this German coin when discovered after maybe not been opened for maybe 80 years or so. As you look at the letter envelope, note that the mailing date is February 22nd, and note the mailing out, March 4th, 1945. There's like 10 days difference there. What's going on here? Well, here's another letter of when Dad was in a writing mood. He writes to his sister, Ruth. They're looking for a nickname for the 69th Division. Congratulations on your promotion. He writes to his letter, Ruth, the editor of the Daily Iowan. If you get a chance, send me a few copies. Note that over here, the red, white, and blue 69 insignia at top shows a new nickname, the 69th Infantry Fighting Division. Dad's entry for a nickname had not been chosen, and so he was not given a leave. But the BBB from old days at Fort Shelby was dropped. Also, if you read about foraging for potatoes when they raided a field, that was new to me. I didn't know about that. Besides the letter congratulating his sister, I have placed a front page article about the battle beyond the Rhine River, published by the UMI newspaper that Ruth was city editor of at the time. She was majoring in journalism in Iowa City at University of Iowa. And I don't have it here, but Ruth later worked for the Milwaukee Journal and was city editor there and a number of other places. Another aspect relating to the war, she was, in a way, she was the first person to be a journalist to be in East Berlin. So she notable for that. She worked for Stars and Stripes for many years. March 25th, 1945. Dad writes, just a note to let you know I'm okay. Now, I guess family members are all different. That was a big emotional statement from my dad. It's no light thing for an infantryman, after all, at age 23, to know after being in battle, his first battle, that he was still alive, that he had done his duty, and that he was not wounded and in the hospital. This is where the heaviest fighting between February 27th and early March had occurred. It was during this first battle campaign, during the Rhineland campaign, that General Reinhardt commanded the 271st, that was Dad's regiment, and wrote on the side of the pamphlets that 2 of the villages on the ridge across the valley from the Ziegfeld line were taken by the 271st in house fighting. And it goes on there and tells more about that. Now, I'll get back to the Battle of the Bulge. Dad wasn't in the Battle of the Bulge. He was in the Battle of the Rhineland. Their unit came in right after the Battle of the Bulge. In fact, they saw a lot of deaths as they marched up from France into into I think it was Belgium, and then finally into Germany. And so they were first replacement troops for those who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Surprise, John. I didn't, I had presumed wrong all that time. Okay, now did all of you who wanted to get an organizational structure for the units here? Yeah, it can be very complicated for me to know the outline of Army organization from the Army division down. But basically, the 69th Division had 14,000 plus soldiers in it. Then under that was the 271st Regiment, where Dad was a soldier, and that had maybe 3,200 men. Dad was assigned to the 1st Battalion of that regiment. These were infantrymen that were fighting, and then he was further in Company C, and that had about 193 soldiers. It's that latter group that probably Dad had the most contact with, that Company C group. Bob was assigned as light machine gun squad leader for approximately the 8 to 12 soldiers that were in his squad. Well, this guess what? My dad and I had different worldviews about the war when I was young. However, since my younger brother Rick, later joined the Marines, I asked him what Dad said to him when he joined the Marines. And he said to him, "Don't argue with the sergeant." And he meant it. So, at any rate, the battle that I had talked to you just about was a turning point. There was a turning point in the first major battle on the 28th of March when Dad's unit reached the Rhine River. They crossed on the Victor Bridge on the Rhine River, which is in the same vicinity. You may have heard of the Remagen Bridge. It's in the same vicinity as that. Okay, so this is probably his first letter he writes this after the campaign, and just talks about the places where they had been, In Hallworth, we started our excursion on the Reich, Blenheim, Niedersbeck, and Ryan and Nassau. The first ones are all asterisks, I noticed, in Dad's personal list, probably people that had died there. I was section sergeant from Hallworth all through all the fighting. Now, I'm not going to comment too much about this, but I talked about the first major battle was called the Rhineland Battle, that Dad was in Company C, and that there's a relatively small number of men. These are some of the men that were killed. These are the men, after doing quite a bit of research, I found out, who were killed in action or died of wounds during that brief time that they were in battle. Dad never said a word about this. Never. Nothing. He probably did know many of these men. Perhaps due to the fire mentioned earlier, I've been unable to determine which, if any of the soldiers actually were from the same squad he was in. But if you wish to know more about the people that died and where they were from, I have put some of that information on the table here that you might want to peruse after the talk. Best I can tell, through the two campaigns that Dad was in World War II, there's about a 50-50 chance that the infantrymen in his regiment would die, or would be a casualty. Say wounded in action. Dear folks, for the last 2 months, I have been leading the machine gun section keeping the boys alive. Plus a little time on the side to down a few quarts of champagne. And it's getting soft as far as drinking goes. He talks about going through cellars of wrecked houses and wine shops. By April 28th, 1945, Dad could write this letter to his parents more freely, expressing what he had been doing during the last 2 months. He opened a window to his Army battles and responsibilities, and about keeping the men in his platoon alive, and talking about intervals of relaxation, as it were. And he observed the destruction seen in towns his regiment had taken. Before going through Dad's military records and other materials, I had not been aware of this. He had not really talked about any of this. Part 4, Victory and Liberation of Germany. This is the Central European Campaign, one of the briefest, fiercest, probably most often forgotten in Germany in 1945, took place during the spring month of April 1945 in and around Leipzig, Germany. It was Dad's second major European battle. Bob's letters home to his parents suggest it was also the most dangerous of the war for him. He nearly lost at least one of the Company C soldiers in these Leipzig and Eilenberg battle that were under his command. Dad was also wounded by shrapnel. More about that later. Here's a map of where they went. And a number of these, there were skirmishes, battles, but I might say, whoops, or whatever. I might say that it's over here at Leipzig and then Eilenberg before reaching Tartu that the worst battles took place. The common map here shows an overview of the route the 69th took to reach Tartu at the end of the war. Late in the war, General Eisenhower determined that he was not going to go into Berlin with his troops. Because of this decision, the last and worst battles for the 69th would be in and around Leipzig and Eilenberg. I'm just an interlude here by a kind of a famous poet and writer, John Ciardi. He was a machine gunner, and he actually wrote in and had this published in an Iowa City magazine called Poetry. It was called Reflections While Oiling a Machine Gun. Why I've kept this poem here is personal reasons. I was reading about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his resistance. He a German Lutheran pastor at the same time as I was researching this for Dad. And then also other poets. This particular very complicated poem looks at basically the waste of war, you know. It's just in World War II, of course, as a machine gunner, you saw that, and he was talking about it and the vigilance toward trying to find ways past war. Dad saved several pictures of over here. This is called Napoleon Monument. He had a lot of these postcards. Like I said, there were no journals that were kept, no really long letters. He says, here is Napoleon Monument before basically, before the city was wrecked, you know, before it was destroyed. And so this was an impenetrable monument, I believe, celebrating victory over Napoleon. And I couldn't figure out why there was so much material just in one baggie, little plastic baggie, having my name on it. And it just didn't make any sense at first. But then I found a letter saying this is what Leipzig looked like during peacetime. As you look at the snap picture up above, this was after the assault and the soldiers coming up into the monument, looking at the monument itself. Inside has these big statues, you know, of various gods and mythical gods. In Eilenberg, I lost the only man in this section that were hit in all the fighting. A machine gun opened up and bullets stopped just 2 feet short of me. The second day, an 88 landed about 20 yards away, wounding a fellow right next to me, right beside me. By 23, Bob was well aware of the tenuousness of life. At the end of his war, he writes to his parents about the impact of it on him. It was on April 21st, then, just hours after the surrender from this battle by the German army, that Dad's platoon was on the front, marching towards a town called Eilenberg, a few miles from Leipzig and situated on the banks of the Mulde River. Eilenberg. Have you ever heard of it? Eilenberg. Dad never talked about this. After VE Day, Dad wrote, I got a piece of shrapnel across the back of my hand, either in Leipzig or Eilenberg, which took out a gash about 1.5 inches long from my knuckle in my index finger on the right hand. But due to the fact that I didn't get medical treatment, I lost my Purple Heart. He was really mad about this. For one thing, the points would have helped him, you know, in terms of getting leaves and stuff. On May 27th, Dad wrote about a gash on his finger during the Eilenberg campaign. When growing up, I remember him talking about it. He said he had been wounded but did not receive a Purple Heart because the lieutenant was too busy attending to other matters. Battle Stars, which are talked about here, are a different award than the Bronze Star Medal. Battle Stars were awarded in recognition of infantrymen, soldiers' battle campaigns. Long after the war was over, Dad disposed of his army uniforms, and but he tore off the stars and other ribbons that he had from his army uniform. At the end of the second battle, there were 17 more infantrymen that were killed in action. These are the men's names here. According to the history of 271st, you can observe that any infantrymen in Company C died in combat on the second battle. Army records show that they suffered heavy casualties among the 1,556 men, and there were 172 that were wounded or killed in the 271st. There's a folder on the table that gives more information about these men that died. On the other side, is it here? Yeah. Dad saved these pictures when he was after Eilenberg. It doesn't have it here. I'm going to go back to Eilenberg for a second. Eilenberg was just a mess. He was among the 271st that was leading in the flank going into Eilenberg, and it was just an absolute mess. Lots and lots of wounded and killed during that first 2 days. The Nazis had been ordered directly not to give up the town until they died, basically. And so what would happen is that the soldiers would go by, they'd clear a house, and the next group would come in, and they would pop from cellars or other places or hiding places and shoot the soldiers. And so going through that town, that may have been where Dad nearly lost one of his men, but many people died. Okay. On May 15th, these two newspaper articles celebrate the American and Russian soldiers meeting up on the banks of the Elbe River. These papers were saved by Dad, and it's interesting to note that that's when he wrote to his parents too about some of the impact of the war on him. What's interesting here to me also is that they met on the Elbe River. That's where Dad was stationed, And one time, just briefly, I think we were talking something about the Russians or something like that. When I was growing up, Dad said that his duties included patrolling that area, and he spoke positively about meeting the Russians, and then going to the middle of the river and drinking vodka. Is this true? Did he actually do that? I'm guessing he did. I don't know. I don't know. That's one of those, I'll have to find out later. All right. This booklet here, this booklet here has a page for autographs and so forth on it. On that book, Dad reserved a page for the names of the people that had been working in his, or not working, but battling with him during the war. So these are the names of the people in his squad that he had led. And I notice on the top of the page, it says reserved, dedicated to one of the soldiers that was wounded in Eilenberg, Germany, the battle I had just talked about. Okay. An epilogue. In 1985, the United States Holocaust Museum and the U.S. Army Center of Military History identified the 69th Infantry as a liberating division, having liberated sick and starving camp prisoners from the Nazi concentration camps at Leipzig-Telka, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald. Dad would have known about this. I do believe he was aware of it. Out of respect for the victims at Leipzig-Telka, I don't wish to show any of the pictures of what it was like. The prisoners were burned and shot. But if you want to know more details and background, you can find it in YouTube videos and photographs. I do have a few articles up here about it too. The Holocaust, more information can be found in the Holocaust Museum at Washington, D.C., and the National World War II Museum also has general information that's very powerful about this. So that was, I might mention, that was the second time the 69th had released prisoners. The little town in Naumburg, where Dad had been stationed and talked about getting soft on drinking. And that's where this pamphlet was published, by the way. Also released some pictures, some prisoners from the Channel Islands. By April 28th, 1945, Dad's war was over in Europe. He made the most of it, swimming, boating, and enjoying time. He indicated that there was no way his dad is ever going, who tried to follow where he went, would figure it out. And so But soon after the defeat at Eilenberg, May 7th, in 1944, on May 7th, 1945, Dad, or 1944, Dad had the intuition that maybe the war would be over at Camp Shelby in a year. General Eisenhower actually accepted the unconditional surrender from the Germans in France on May 7th, 1945. So he got it pretty close. On May 8th, VE Day was declared. So as indicated above, this was a time of rest for him and enjoying visits to European cities. He was on leave. There is not shown here on the record, but it was May when VE Day was, but August 15th was the end of the war. The 271st Infantry was scheduled to go to Japan next. So during that time, it was about July, Dad gets a letter from who but Emmett Willie Hall. Emmett Willie had been one of the group from Hawaii that went to the Marshall Islands and then to Okinawa. At Okinawa, he says he was wounded 3 times. His letter is just very ragged. It's clear that he's in a lot of pain, and that, but that's what happened to him, his buddy, and he wrote, and they continued to write. Okay, so August 15th arrives, and end of the war. Bob's conflict is over, and then after the surrender, Dad is just not going to waste time. In like October 1945, back home from the war, Dad didn't waste any time. Soon after finding a job at a bank in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, he met Nadine Gorman, Mom, and asked her to marry him on their first date. She said no. But Dad loaned her his army jacket, which is shown here. That's these pictures are probably taken from time when he was when Mom was engaged and showed it off to her cousin, and as well as wore it with Dad. So, well, I had started out trying to find out more about the Bronze Star Medal, and in 2025 says that this Bronze Star Medal is being shipped, and that I could expect it any time now in 2034, or maybe 2035, or maybe some other time. So that was really exciting. I wrote a really nice letter back and said, I understand to TACOM their U.S. how busy they are, and she's one of the few, if only, people that is in charge of all this for U.S. military medals and all that. And I had just wanted to follow up on questions about Dad and his military background. It doesn't. Then I want to say after the first presentation and that first letter, 2034 through 2035, whoa, first a year happens. It says, Happy New Year, John. The medals are arriving. So there, it was very nice. So the replacement medal for the Bronze Star Medal is shown. Just a word about that. Many people received the Bronze Star Medal, maybe 1 in 7 of infantrymen, but many more were awarded for it. In Dad's case, for the first battle in the Rhineland, but never received it because they didn't make a formal request. The Meritorious Service Award for the Bronze Star Medal actually was finally approved in 1947. There was the other for courageous action was approved prior to that. But because of, I mean, I don't know, for whatever reason, unless you sent for the medal, you didn't get it. Just that's an interesting bit of background there. In fact, it says, unless the veteran went through the process of writing the government asking for their medals, many World War II veterans never received the actual campaign or victory medals. After Dad's 3 years of World War II training and enduring two major infantry battles, he joined the Army Reserves for several years, ending sometime soon after he left. And then in the reserves, during the Korean War, I believe it was, he had to go to Camp McCoy. He didn't go beyond that, but he was at Camp McCoy for a while. And my first memory is actually of him and Mom talking about him going away. But as I was about 2 years old. In summary, in World War II, Dad endured long years of long military training, followed by going into infantry battles where they experienced high numbers of casualties. Like I mentioned, maybe 50% of the men were either died or wounded. What started out for me as a genealogical project of chronologically arranging Dad's wartime memorabilia and turned into getting a better understanding of his story. Just appreciations here for all the many people that have helped me out here. The adult library staff with the thanks so much in helping with the slides, and then Emily Golden, a number of people who had been in the Army, Lynn and Terry here, and out there someplace is Mary Wilson, who was pretty so and several others, my brother, so. And then I want to also acknowledge Zach Skelton at the Story County Veterans Affairs graciously gave me a great deal of time and helped me in explaining what some of Robert's Army records meant. Michael Vogt, the curator at the Camp Dodge Maneuver Training Center, library in Johnston, Iowa, gave me insight and knowledge into the military history and larger perspectives. Timothy McLaughlin, over in Nevada at the American Legion, William F. Ball Post 48, generously gave his time showing where Dad's World War II plaque is located and giving a brief history of how the American Legion came about. That's it. Thank you.